Hello, I'm David Stishon, and this video is about two events and a road which impacted the War for Independence. By the mid-18th century, there were millions of colonists living in North America. Many of them had come from the Old World to the New World looking for opportunities, mostly land. These people were mostly farmers. They had come to the East Coast from New England to Middle Atlantic, or even some of the southern colonial areas had come in through the tidewaters into the interior. By the 1600s, late 1600s, people began to move into the interior, what was called the Piedmont areas, mostly in upstate New York and into Pennsylvania and some of the areas around Philadelphia back when that was part of the frontier. By the 1760s, however, a large number of people were expecting to move into the backcountry following the 7 Years' War, or French and Indian War. They had figured that they had fought this war long against the French and the Indians, that was their opportunity then to move into settling this frontier area. But in 1763, Pontiac's War began. You see, these Indians from the Great Lakes all the way down into the mountains of the Smokies determined that they were French, that the soldiers of the Empire of France had surrendered, but they had not. So within 9 days, they had attacked over a dozen British forts on the frontier. Once they had either destroyed them and massacred all the soldiers or placed them under long-term siege, they began to push against the settlements on the frontier, all the way from the Great Lakes down to the Smokies. So people who were settled in this area then refugeed back to the east. They went back to the Philadelphia area or back to the mountains of Virginia, back into the tidewater areas. Wanting to continue to go west, they were also stopped by the Royal Line of 1763. So those who wished to go beyond the Appalachian Mountains into the Ohio River territory were halted by the Royal Line, or the Proclamation line of 1763. So instead of moving west, many of them instead moved south. They came down what was called the Warrior's Path, or sometimes called the Philadelphia Wagon Road, or just the Wagon Road, or the road as it was called. Several thousand came down each year in the 1730s and 1750s. These people were German Moravians, Lutherans. Then by the 1750s, you had large numbers of Scots-Irish Presbyterians coming south. So by the late 1760s, you now have the tidewater regions of the East Coast and the mountains to the west. This proclamation line meant they weren't supposed to go west of that, but they could indeed fill the Piedmont. This was totally unexpected by the British Empire. These people came in not as immigrants from Europe, particularly from Great Britain. No, these were second and third generation Americans. When they arrived, they came out as congregations. So they were in companies that could protect themselves, but they were also a church without a building. They were dissenting religions. They were Presbyterians, they were Lutherans, they were Moravians, they could be Baptists or even Quakers. And as they came down in groups, they wished to be left alone in certain areas and valleys, and often went up into the foothills so they could practice their faith. They were already dissenting because they were not Church of England or Anglicans. So this dissent on the frontier, which was Alexander Craighead, Samuel Davies, and many of these revolutionary ministers, what started as dissent, religious dissent, became political dissent by 1775 and the beginning of the American Revolutionary War. This is the remnant of a colonial wagon road. These were originally buffalo traces. The woodland bison used these to travel from one part to another to feed, but then the Indians used these for trade and for war. By the 1730s, the European settlers were traveling down roads like this. They call it the Great Wagon Road or the Philadelphia Wagon Road. They came by the thousands each year. The German Moravians to start with, then some Lutherans, followed by the Scots-Irish Presbyterians. As they came here, they were dissenting in their religious beliefs from the Church of England, the established church. But this religious dissension began to move into political dissension as they felt that they had been left out of politics and didn't have the proper representation in their colonial legislatures. There was not enough protection out here into the forest and frontiers, and they felt, therefore, that they were paying too many taxes for too little service from the colonial governments. So these wagon roads, like you see today, they're beginning to erode away. They're not really a location. They're more of part of that journey or destination, as what became 100,000 perhaps before the Revolution became millions of Southerners by the time of the American Civil War. This is Sugar Creek Presbyterian Church in Charlotte, North Carolina. This was an early colonial church, one of the few still standing from before the Revolutionary War. Reverend Alexander Craighead was one of the pastors here. He was one of the most revolutionary ministers of the Presbyterian Church here before the War for Independence. He was influenced strongly by the Great Awakening, by the preaching of George Whitefield, and he came from Pennsylvania to pastorage in Virginia, all the way to this church in the early 1760s. While here, he influenced a lot of the Presbyterian settlers in this area, many of which began to resist against the Anglican church or established church and parishes here in the North Carolina colony. This, what began as religious resistance, became political resistance by the late 1760s. Prior to the large group of people who came from Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Maryland down the Great Wagon Road of the 1760s, there had been a large influx of Highland Scots who came from Scotland to America, particularly North Carolina, in the 1740s and 1750s. These people had been just about transported. They were Jacobites. They had lost their second revolt of the 18th century against the British Empire. This large group of people were expected to be a kind of a loyalist group to support the crown as the rest of the South became Patriot or Whig. Flora McDonald, for example, and her husband and family moved to America, into North Carolina, into this area around Cross Creek, just prior to the breakout of the War for Independence. The British Empire actually depended upon them and raised a couple of thousand loyalist troops from among these former Highlanders in 1775 and 1776. As they went to the coast that year, 1776, what happened is the Patriot militias shadowed this group that was headed for the coast, trying to get arms and support from a regular army that was landing from Boston. The defeat they suffered in February of 1776 at Moore's Creek Bridge stopped this loyalist army that was being built in the South early. So it was not until 1780, when the return of British troops under Cornwallis, as they first captured Savannah in 1778, and then Charleston in 1780, and then they destroyed Gates's army at Camden. That meant that there were no regular army or continental troops in the entire South, south of Virginia. Cornwallis and his troops spread out across the Carolinas and Georgia. They actually reconstituted many of the Loyalist militias, and they began to set up garrisons at such places as Camden and 96 and other cities in the Piedmont to try to regain control of the Loyalist areas of North and South Carolina. What happened, however, was a surprise, and something happened in late 1780 which changed the complexion of the entire, not only the Revolutionary War in the South, but the War for Independence as a whole. This is the reconstructed Fort Caswell at Sycamore Shoals. In 1780, this was part of western North Carolina. By 1796, it became part of the new state of Tennessee. This is truly where the Kings Mountain Campaign begins. Following the Battle of Cane Creek in Rutherford County, North Carolina, British Colonel Patrick Ferguson sent a message in an interesting way across the mountains. He found that one of his prisoners was, was Samuel Phillips, who was a distant relative of John Severe's. He wrote a message to them basically telling them that they should lay down their arms across the mountains, or the British Army would march across those mountains, hang their leaders, and lay their country waste with fire and sword. This message had the opposite impact on the Over Mountain men, however. John Sevier met with other leaders, Isaac Shelby and others, and they decided instead that they needed to solve their Ferguson problem. Messages went out through the valleys and rivers throughout the Over Mountain area. Within a number of days, they had 1,600 Over Mountain volunteers had come here from Virginia and all over what is now Tennessee. They mustered here in these fields that you see around this fort. They lined up the Watauga settlement troops and they numbered them 1 through 7. And every 7th soldier they pulled out to stay behind to protect the settlement against the Cherokees who had gone to the warpath on the encouragement of the British. And so before they left, they gathered their troops and the families before they left. And a young 31-year-old minister, Reverend Samuel Doak, gave them what was called the sermon heard round the world. This sermon encouraged these troops to not only protect their families, but to fight for their nation and to come back safely to help them fight the Cherokees. That happened here on September 25th of 1780. The Patriot militia and Over Mountain riflemen who came to this area to find Major Ferguson went up this hillside toward the top of the ridge that forms Kings Mountain. On top of this ridge, nearly 1,000 Loyalist militia and provincial troops under British officer Major Patrick Ferguson had gone up to the top of the hill in a defensive location. They had just heard that nearly 1,000 Over Mountain men and Patriot militia from the Piedmont area of Virginia, North Carolina, East Tennessee, South Carolina, and even a few from Georgia were on their way looking for Major Ferguson. What happened here was a surprise. This was not expected by anyone. It was like a big chessboard, and suddenly a large number of pieces came from the edge of the board over the mountains and through the Piedmont to attack. It was unexpected. The Battle of Kings Mountain on October 7th, 1780 is preserved and interpreted in a very interesting way. You not only have a battlefield park that the federal government maintains, but also the state park which surrounds it with a living history village. In addition to the battlefield itself, there is the Over Mountain Victory Trail, which is represented on the map that you see here on various highways. These match the areas that the Patriot forces took to find the British forces and Loyalist forces under Ferguson. Following the battle here, the prisoners that were taken from the Loyalists, as well as the surviving Patriots, then had to move rapidly off the battlefield. They had heard that Major Tarleton, another British officer with his forces, which included cavalry, would be following them to destroy them. And so they retreated as rapidly as possible away from the battlefield. A week after the Battle of Kings Mountain, on October 14th, 1780, the Patriot forces halted here on Widow Bickerstaff's plantation, north of Gilberttown. Here, they held a trial after dark, and they tried and convicted 30 of the Loyalist leaders to death. They hung them off a single tree, 3 at a time, a tree similar to the one that you see here. The original one died and was cut up in 1954. But this tree was well known as the Bickerstaff hanging tree for almost 200 years after the Battle of Kings Mountain and the hanging of the Loyalists. The battles of Kings Mountain and Cowpens, followed by Guilford Courthouse, weakened Cornwallis's force and changed his campaign in the South. Moving toward the coast to get supplies and reinforcements, what he found is that the French Navy had gotten there first, followed by General Washington with his American and French forces. After a few weeks' siege, he was forced to surrender. The English Parliament at that moment said that was enough. They were not going to win the war in America, as they could see after losing in the Southern Campaign. The troops that fought these battles were not the Continental forces. They had either been captured through the surrender at Charleston or had been destroyed at Camden. Instead, you had those from the Piedmont and the Overmountain, the militia and the volunteers, who came out and fought against portions of this army and destroyed it so that General Nathanael Greene and his forces could then enter the battle. I'm Dave Stichon, and I hope that you've enjoyed this video.